So I'm going to get us started with a little introduction to today's event. So my name is Stephen Young. I am an associate professor of geography and international studies here at UW-Madison. I'm also the faculty director with IRIS NRC. We are one of the centers on campus funded by the US Department of Education. And our mission is to offer programming and expertise to K-12 and post-secondary educators, students, and the community at large that inspires informed thinking about the complex cross-regional issues in our world today. You can find more information about our events and resources on our webpage, irisnrc.com. You'll find presentations, conversations with artists, academics, and activists, and also recordings of the previous sessions we've had talking about the book that is going to be the topic of conversation today. Today's event is being co-sponsored by the Havens Wright Center for Social Justice, the Center for Southeast Asia, and the Department of Anthropology at UW-Madison. So thank you to our co-sponsors. Claire Lamoureux will be running the tech today. If you have any challenges, you can use the chat function to contact her. We will be recording today's event and sharing the recording via email with people who registered but cannot attend at this time. But you will only show up on the recording if your microphone is turned on to speak. Before we move to the main event, I want to acknowledge that the University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejob since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. And today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Right then, so the dawn of everything. Some of you have been here for all of the three prior events. And so today we reach our thrilling finale where we're going to talk about the last part of the book, and also then talk about the sort of its broader implications in terms of how we teach, how we think about the world, how we the different kinds of audiences we might engage with. And I'm delighted that we have two guests to help us through that. One of them is someone who's been here at the previous meeting, Nam Kim. He is an anthropological archaeologist here at UW-Madison, interested in socio-political complexity, early forms of cities, factors associated with significant cultural change, and the relationship between modern politics, cultural heritage, and the material record. And since 2005, he's been conducting archaeological fieldwork in Vietnam at the Co Lao settlement in the Red River Delta. And as those of you who are here for the second of our four book clubs will know, Nam was critical. He was the first person who I said, hey, what do you think about this book? Should we do a book club about it? And he said, yeah, that sounds interesting. And here we all are. So I'm forever grateful that he was willing to entertain the idea. Our second guest today is Patrick Iber, who is an associate professor of history on our campus. Patrick is a historian of 20th century Latin America and US foreign relations. His interests broadly include the politics of culture and intellectuals, socialism and democracy, poverty and inequality, cultural diplomacy and imperialism, and the added value of transnational approaches to history. His first book, Neither Peace Nor Freedom, The Cultural Cold War in Latin America, examined how artists, writers, and intellectuals participated in and generated Cold War conflicts. And his new book project looks at how social scientists have understood and responded to poverty and inequality in 20th century Latin America. And in addition to his scholarly work, he also endeavors to write for a public audience. He's on the editorial board at Dissent and has written for, as well as that publication, Jacobin, Slate, The Baffler, The Nation, and many others. So my gratitude to our two guests for joining us today to help provide a little extra context and insight and some additional questions to steer our conversation. So as we reach the end of this, I'm going to maybe hand over first of all to Nam Kim and ask you, Nam, to bring us up to date with your thinking about the book, maybe with some thoughts about also this sort of final section. But since you weren't here last week, anything else that you want to sort of bring into the discussion today?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you, Stephen, for bringing me into this entire endeavor, and the IRIS NRC for organizing all of this. It's a pleasure to be here. I suppose in terms of bringing things up to date, in my reading of the last couple of chapters, one of the things that struck me was going back to the idea of the state itself. And something that the authors describe as, I believe that the choice words were a fool's errand in trying to ascertain the origins of the state. In some ways, I kind of agree that it is sort of ephemeral and difficult to pinpoint. And then when we're talking about the archaeological record, there are challenges, of course, in terms of equifinality, where there are many possible scenarios that we have to test, that we have to continue to collect data, and our ideas and arguments continue to change as a result of that, as our technologies improve, as our questions change. But I think a lot of it also depends on one's definition of the state itself. And that's something that I kind of want to get into maybe to start with. And I'd be interested to hear what some of the folks in the room also think about the definition. The one that kind of came through from the book has to do with different political forms or bases of power. They talk about this kind of confluence. They discussed control of violence, control of information, and individual charisma as these three disparate bases of power. And from my understanding of the argument, these bases come up separately in different times and places, and they come together in these kinds of state-level institutions or organizations. Although they critique the use of the term or the concept of the state. And in some ways, I believe the argument is in invoking the state, we are projecting our conceptions of what states ought to look like, or maybe what they look like in the historically recent eras of the globe, and we project them into the past. And I think they have an issue with that kind of projection. In some ways, I agree with what they say, but in other ways, I disagree. I think that the basis of power, that's something that few of us would argue with, that we can make out different forms of power. I would probably add other dimensions to their list, not just the three that they outline. But I also wonder if the idea of a fool's errand is valid or not, because if we think about it, there are no two states in the modern world that are the same, and yet we study different political organizations, different forms of social organizations and polities of the modern world. If we were to tease out that argument and continue a little bit further, are they then arguing that we should abandon these sorts of comparative studies, that it's not fruitful to have this sort of concept? That I'm not sure if it's easy to interpret or not from their book. But in terms of the modern state, there's something of what I would call academic Mad Libs, because they say maybe we shouldn't use the term civilization or states, but they use other phrasing that to me encapsulates many of the same kinds of ideas and frameworks. I think there was one point where I saw the phrasing broad regional systems. So as opposed to saying different polities, they're talking about the functions of these polities, which might be analogous whether we're talking about the historically recent or the deeper archaeological past. But in any case, that's one thing that I wanted to bring up. And it might be sort of a continuation of some of the conversations that have been happening even last week, when I think there was discussion about some of the examples of states in the past, such as Teotihuacan. But I'll leave it there as a sort of opening starting point.
Thank you so much, Nam. Patrick, from the world of history, some thoughts and reflections and questions that you wanted to bring to the table today.
Certainly, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I'm looking forward to it, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from from Nam and from others with expertise in some of these areas. Obviously, this is a book that ranges over an extraordinarily wide array of times and places. And I have a distinct reaction, perhaps, that comes out of my professional training. I mean, in history and in other fields as well, the basic currency of our professional lives is the scholarly monograph. We study something in depth to know it really well, and that takes a good deal of time. To write a good scholarly monograph takes approximately a decade. So we get a few of them in a lifetime. Then there are these big synthetic books that people write. And to write these big synthetic books, they necessarily move outside of the areas that they have studied very carefully. Sure, this is not unique to, it's not unique to history. It must be true in other fields as well. And sometimes even people from other fields come in to your field and write one of these big synthetic books based on readings of the literature in one way or another. It could be a journalist or somebody sort of interloping. Often it's an economist. They seem to like to do that quite a bit. And I'm just always incredibly suspicious that anyone thinks that they can take on that kind of task, knowing how much work it takes to get things right in a much narrower domain. That to pull things together and to pull the complexity together into a single narrative always makes me wonder, how it's possible for somebody to have done that. And furthermore, I get more suspicious when all of the evidence that is marshaled seems to be pointing in the same direction, because the world is a complicated place. And we know from our deep studies how complicated it is. And then if the survey suddenly suggests that things are much in some way, I mean, there's a huge amount of complexity in this book, but in a sense, there's no evidence that really pushes against the theory that the authors are presenting. And that I just get so worried that what I'm reading doesn't reflect the best available evidence. So I had that reaction throughout the experience of reading this book. Second, Nam brings up the question of the state and how they define the state. For me, or perhaps a kind of the mirror image of that question, is how they define freedom. Because I think for them, freedom is the absence of state coercion. This is a classic anarchist position, that societies are self-organizing, or at least can be self-organizing, and that condition of being self-organizing maximizes the possibilities of human freedom. And so I just want to throw that out there and as another possible topic for us to discuss, because there may be some insight to that kind of definition, but there may also be some problems with that way of thinking about freedom. And in general, people use the word freedom all the time, and without defining it very carefully. And so that's another issue that I put on the table for us to discuss. Finally, you read a book like this, you ask yourself, I ask myself, what the purpose of the book is. Is this a scholarly book or a political book? Does it represent a scholarly project of inquiry and of advancing knowledge, or is it a political book? Of course, sometimes people successfully combine the two things. And so a book can be both scholarly and political. I don't mean to draw some kind of false distinction between those two texts. But where I think it's important for this, as we consider this book, if it's the case that the scholarly side falls apart, the question then of what are the implications for the political project that is behind the author's exploration of the topic, I think becomes a very relevant question. And beyond that, you know, David Graeber really was a major figure in the world left, through Occupy Wall Street, of which he was one of the major architects. He's had a huge impact on politics. So in that sense, he was completely successful. That this book was, that wasn't coming from this book exactly, but coming from out of debt, his book Debt, and other works. And so I ask whether a more accurate book might be less politically effective, and whether I don't know, how do we evaluate the merits and demerits of a book that may really start to collapse when you start poking and prodding at it at the level of scholarly rigor and accuracy, but that nevertheless galvanizes people to, as the authors say, sort of imagine new and different forms of social reality. That seems to me to be their goal, and in a certain way, they've done that. So even as I'm bothered by certain aspects of the book, there's a part of his project which is undeniably appealing, and so I'm really caught in that feeling of deep ambiguity. And I will close there. Look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Nam, did you want to add anything in there? And I'm thinking specifically, I mean, in that sense, one of the things that I went into this book club really interested to learn about was whether indeed, as someone who has no training in archaeology in terms of methods, or in terms of understanding how evidence is interpreted, your overall assessment, because clearly there are, I mean, like, I think we would all imagine that there are going to be things where they get it, points where they get it wrong, and certainly points where their interpretation is going to be disputed. But does it collapse? Does it stand up? Or is it somewhere in between when we get to read that?
I would say it's somewhere in between. I think that there are definitely issues in terms of presentation of varied perspectives and viewpoints, and that are based on different interpretations of the same material records. I think Patrick makes an excellent point about the depth of research that's necessary to become knowledgeable about a particular case study or a region or its history. The authors necessarily have to be superficial in their treatment of many of these world regions and their histories in order to make some of these arguments and to have this sort of synthetic coverage. And in that respect, I'm thinking of, for example, their work or their perspectives about the antiquity of forms of organized violence and warfare. They spent a few pages talking about this towards the end, and the role that violence and forms of sacrifice, how they might be tied to religious ritual practices, and how they might be tied to states, even though they don't want to use the word state, but here I'm inserting that myself. One of the things that they argued was that warfare is something that is very, I don't want to say that, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but it seems like it is more of a recent and very sporadic sort of occurrence. Whereas the anthropological research on this is quite disputed and full of nuance. There are arguments that war is relatively recent, that its origins can be tied to the emergence of sedentary lifestyles, to agricultural lifestyles, to urbanism, cities, and so forth, all maybe in the mid-Holocene. Then you have folks who say, no, actually, if you look at other streams of evidence, you can go back into the ice ages. You can make the argument that we've evolved as a species to be extremely violent and warlike. In looking at Pleistocene fossil records, for instance, or in looking at analogs with the primate world. So it is a very complex set of debates, and they gloss over a lot of that sort of research in making some of their arguments and saying that it requires rituals and hallucinogenic drugs and various kinds of leadership strategies to compel people to participate in forms of systematic violence. And so that's where certain kinds of social organizations become necessary to see forms of organized violence. So that's, I think, a perfect example of what Patrick might be referring to in terms of glossing over bodies and bodies of research. The other thing that I think he raised was this idea of freedom, and I think this is a valid point that would be interesting to have a conversation around as well, because when we think about freedom, the authors have a perspective about this, but I would ask, and I'm similarly skeptical about this, is it an idea that we are also still projecting into the past? Would all cultures and societies of the present and of the past have the same views about what constitutes freedom? Is freedom something that is applicable to everyone within your community, within your society? And if you flip that argument around, when we're talking about freedom, are we also talking about forms of wealth or equality, standards of living, access to medical care, other kinds of resources? These are highly variable no matter what society you're talking about. And so to say that there is this notion of freedom that all humans will have a sort of shared baseline understanding of, and that this is applicable in the distant past as well, I find that potentially problematic to think about. So I guess just a couple of quick responses to some of the points that were raised.
That's great. Thank you so much. So I believe, and let me know if this is wrong, Claire, but I think that people can now unmute themselves. I guess you can, if you have a comment or question, try this out, but we'll open it up to the whole group now. Some of you may be new, in which case welcome, and feel free to jump in. Some of you have been to previous sessions. This is our last 40 minutes, because I'm saving the last 5 minutes for myself, to talk about this. So please do offer some comments, and we can collect 2 or 3 comments at a time as well, and then respond to that. Mark.
Hello, I'm a professor of theater and performance studies, and I've written quite a bit on different cultures. So I'm really interested in what you think of this focus on play, especially toward the end of the book, as opposed to heroic theater and war that emerges again and again, and they say has come to dominate through Western colonialism, and even going back the last 2,000 years in European history especially. So they give many examples of how there might be alternatives relating to the notion of freedom and alternate forms of statecraft. But my question, and even with female leaders or mother goddesses. So my question is, how can we understand through their book? I appreciate the anthropologists questioning how the breadth of their work and how that may overlook a lot of data, but their overall argument to me seems quite important regarding the question of how can societies maintain a playfulness, as they talk about a playful police force that's seasonal, that's more egalitarian, has degrees of being egalitarian than, or shifting leadership rather than oppressive, dominant fixed leadership. And at one point in these final paragraphs, they even say that you can have a play king and games that, you know, are involved in positive ways to be competitive within a society. And yet, once the killing starts, then it's real. So, especially given what's happened in Ukraine recently, where they went from an actor in a TV series about a high school teacher becoming a president to being in a war zone, how can we use this book to better understand that dangerous shift that seems to occur often in history, and as they point out, with the evidence in prehistory of alternatives? Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Other comments or questions that we can add to the mix at this stage?
I think I can jump in if that's okay.
Please do, Katie.
Thank you. So yeah, to this point about, I think at the end, wrapping things up and kind of what's the point of this book, whether it's done better or worse, some of the kind of things they're trying to do, ask more interesting questions of history, get into some of the new evidence that we have from across different fields. They're telling a story that is trying to overturn a Eurocentric colonial justification type natural law view of the world, and recover egalitarian social structures as new possibilities for today as I see it. So, I mean, for me, the question of freedom is comes down to kind of some of their final claims that are very pessimistic, that we live in a world order that is predicated on nation states. We have a system of international law that is enforceable through various mechanisms. For them, I think probably economic mechanisms would be supremely important to think about oppression and domination today. People cannot move and disobey and create new forms of society at will, as they seem to think freedom entails, given how they're defining it, whether that's a contemporary definition or not. So at the end of the day, I mean, they're trying to maybe just encourage us that things can change, reform is possible, but in light of the dominance of Rome and its international implications for us today is, you know, I just wonder, yeah, I mean, what are they prescribing here in the end? So that's the question. I'm left with a question, and more pessimism than I think the optimism that the playful and hopeful side of this work would try to encourage in readers.
Thank you, Katie, who of course was our guest in session 1 and got us started in such a productive direction. Jennifer.
Thanks. Just to tag on to Katie's comment, also, this is the second book that I read over the space of 2 years that does try to do this sort of all-encompassing, this is the direction of humanity kind of thing, the other being Sapiens by Harari, and that also being, you know, feeling like in the end that's terribly unsatisfying. And I wondered, kind of tagging also onto Patrick's comments at the beginning about this desire to do this all-encompassing history or all-encompassing history of humanity. Are we seeing more and more of these books? So are more people kind of headed down that? It's not something I see myself doing, I hope, and I don't really want to read a lot of these books that much. I mean, I find this book incredibly thought-provoking and at the same time frustrating for all the reasons that you've listed.
Thank you, Jennifer. Well, there's 3 thoughts to maybe help stir a bit more conversation. So at this point, Patrick or Nam, is there anything you'd like to add to or respond to out of those comments?
Sure, I can't. Nam, would you like to go first, or would you like? Okay. Let me start with Katie's comment, because I think it's relevant to the question that Mark asked, and as well. it goes back to this idea of the idea of freedom, and as Don was saying, we're projecting our own ideas of what freedom constitutes back onto the past. Other people would have thought about it differently. I mean, I would say two things. In part, I don't totally share. I mean, I don't share the author's pessimism, if that's the way that we're going to put it. I think that they're unduly pessimistic in part because they have a pretty, in my mind, actually, what is a pretty rigid idea of what would constitute a good society, and I think that it's no accident that they have resorted to explorations of ancient history for examples of what they consider societies containing or governed, if that, or not governed, whatever, however we want to describe it, right, by relationships of non-domination. I think that and the reason that they can't do more contemporary examples are that, there have been attempts during the Spanish Civil War, for example. There was enormous regions of Spain were put under anarchist control. And they tried some of these systems of governance at the village level. And in certain ways, they function just fine. You could have rotating leadership, and that it can work within communities with relative equality and relative agreement about what the tasks are. I mean, we do this in academic departments, right? I heard Noam Chomsky, who's another, academic anarchist, once say, well, we do this in academic departments. Why can't we do it more broadly? I mean, well, academic departments are very slow. And I'm not sure that I would want to generalize like the form of the academic department to be the only form of governance structure that can exist out there. These anarchist experiments in Spain faced all kinds of organizational challenges when having to deal with things behind the Republican lines, where the communists wanted things to have more discipline in order to fight the fascist armies that were coming in their direction. And so there are both moments where these kinds of relationships can emerge and can be successful, and then there are also real limits, I think, in other contexts. And I think that if they had chosen more contemporary examples, they would have had to have faced those challenges a little bit more directly. But by keeping things in the very distant past, they can avoid those kinds of, I think they can avoid those kind of difficult questions. But I actually don't think that that's such a depressing thing to say, because I think that they're wrong, that small community, the kind of communities that they imagine are the only ways to experience freedom. And I think that we can have lots of relationships of non-domination within structures of governance that exist to manage larger and more complex societies. So I sort of don't buy the picture of the ancient world that they're portraying, and I'm not totally convinced by their portrayal of the sort of implicit portrayal of the present. So I think that we can do better in certain ways, and do better along lines that they would probably agree with are positive. I mean, I'm not like really deeply hostile to the political project, but I think that they're making a kind of a couple of important errors there in ways that make it seem like the world has fallen from some earlier state of grace. And I think it's somewhat graceless all along, but that we can do better. And so I guess that goes a little bit to Mark's question. I do teach courses on the history of Latin America, and we do often start with the major pre-European contact empires, the Aztec and the Inca. So I know this is not exactly what they're talking about here. I mean, they talked about Tlaxcala quite a bit as the group that sides with the Spanish after fighting the Spanish in Mexico, and then in the the combat with Tenochtitlan, what is today's Mexico City, but at the time was the heart of the Aztec Empire. I have absolutely no disagreement with the violence of Western, describing the violence of Western colonialism. I do not agree that Western colonialism is the source of violence in the world. I just don't think that there's any way to sustain that claim on the basis of the evidence that we have, what human societies were like before contact with Western colonialism. There's plenty of and the Aztec society is a great example of that. One of the basic reason that the Tlaxcalans sided with the Spaniards was that they were under imperial rule. It wasn't European imperial rule, but they were under imperial rule, and they found in the Spanish the possibility of an ally that could change that relationship for them. In the long run, it didn't work out in their favor, but they paid tribute of all kinds to the Aztec Empire, and so you can look at the Tlaxcalans as engaged in a kind of anti-imperial revolt by joining with the Spanish. I mean, it's a sort of a bit of a provocation, but it's not too much of a provocation, right? And then to Jennifer's question, like, people like to sell these books. They sell a lot. I don't know who likes to read them, but people like to sell them. So they do come. I mean, some are better than others, right? And sometimes, sometimes a flawed but provocative book can nevertheless generate productive conversation. So maybe that's the kind of thing that we have going on here as well. Turn it over to you now.
Okay, thank you. Well, first, I would like to agree with one of the statements you just made. All societies, past and present, are capable of forms of warfare and organized violence. It's not a matter of being influenced by one type of civilization versus another. That's something that the archaeological record, the more we interrogate it, the more we see. And it's not necessarily an indictment on human nature. It's just we're exceedingly plastic, and our forms of behavior are very dependent on the environmental and social surroundings that we live within. So in some ways, I think that takes us as a segue into some of the comments. I think Jennifer and Katie, that you were asking about how much of this should be viewed with pessimism or optimism. I think it's largely subjective. It really, to me, one of the benefits of this book or something like it, or its mission, is that it makes us confront a lot of these histories and bring some of those themes and topics into our conversations. As an archaeologist looking at the long-term changes in human history, I tend to take a more optimistic view because I think about how changes happen across vast stretches of time. So all kinds of outcomes are possible. We might be subjective in our views, and I think the authors are very subjective in their views about what we are living in right now in terms of the kinds of societies that we find ourselves within. And I think Patrick, you intimated this earlier, they have a sort of rigid view of what it should look like. And the fact that we don't live in that kind of society, there's a sort of aspirational quality to their argument that there are things that we should be working towards and that we're clearly not there yet. That may be the case, but it is a very subjective perspective. So it really depends on our views and our cultural logics, how we see relationships around us. And again, this goes back to the idea of freedom itself. Everyone has a different idea of what freedom means, or even the idea of justice. What is just for some might be completely unjust for others. One of the things that this goes back to the comments and questions that Mark offered about the ideas of play. I want to talk about that just for a second. I think that comes through in a couple of important ways in the book that I think are positives in terms of contributions that the book makes. One aspect of play we can say is the idea of tinkering or social experimentation. That's the argument that the authors are making about human history, that if we interrogate the archaeological record, we can see different versions of societies and how people, the same people even, depending on season or time of year, can tinker with their social and political organization. We see this ethnographically as well and historically as well. So that, I think, speaks a little bit to this idea of play. The other thing that Mark mentioned that I think that comes up with the idea of play is the performative side of governance. Because if we think about some of these places, like Teotihuacan, or like Cusco, or places in ancient Bronze Age China, for instance, you have these massive monuments with plazas, open squares, where the trappings of the state are tied very much to public displays and public rituals. And I think one of the contributions that the book makes, it brings to mind some of the arguments. I think they quoted, I was not familiar with the work of Hocart, where they referenced his work in saying that perhaps the very first kings were dead kings, right? So it is the individuals who become part of the supernatural or the divine. They're revered as the first sorts of leaders, as authorities. Maybe these sorts of ritual ceremonies, these belief systems are at the heart of these bases of power, right? They don't explicitly talk about ideology, but I think that's a very important part of power. And here I'm thinking about some of the archaeological evidence for bog bodies in Europe, for instance, during the Bronze Age and Iron Age, where we suspect now that some of these sacrificed individuals who were killed and placed into these contexts may have been royal figures or leaders of some kind. And if you think about it from that perspective, the rituals, the ceremonies, this idea of performance becomes very important as parts of social complexity and political authority. My own thinking is, with some of these very early forms of centralized political authority, part of the basis of power when we're talking about ideology is that they appropriated the mundane. They appropriated rituals that everybody was familiar with, but they claimed to have the highest forms of those rituals. And if we go to the Shang, for instance, in China, practices related to divination and communication with the ancestors and the supernatural beings, everyone was doing this in terms of divination practices, but the Shang royal court said that we had the highest form of this. So we can see elements of that performance and play, these ideas that people tinker, and then eventually the state appropriates what they want in order to legitimize power, to legitimize these differences. I think that might be part of this larger argument of play as well. But I'll stop there. But I think that there's a lot of potential food for thought.
Thanks to both of you. I'm watching the clock. I want to get as much conversation as we can in before we come to the end of our hour. If someone wants to ask a question, I'm also going to try and get a couple of questions from the chat. But Leslie, I can see you have unmuted. Go right ahead.
Thank you. I'm not in any of these fields, but I was wondering who of those of you who have contributed the most have you resented the time taken to read and think about this book? And is there anything, any part of the book, any part of the arguments that the authors have presented that might or could influence your future work?
That's a great question. Let me try and roll it together with, let me see, Dan has posted something in here where he says, I get the problem with Harari, Jared Diamond, etc., because they seem to be imposing a sort of model on history. Graeber and Wengrow, however, it seems as though they're trying to sort of knock that down with their anarchist perspective. They're mostly trying to sort of shake the tree. And I read all the history now with that fallen fruit, it's very lyrical this, around my feet, and find it very helpful. General histories, Dan is saying, are helpful for academic history being relevant to the contemporary moment. Do academic historians in the group find the dawn of everything doing the same thing in their practices, whatever their criticisms in it? And I think that this is an important question. I mean, I think I've mentioned in one of the early ones that, you know, Wengrow himself has described this more as brushwork. Like, we need to get rid of some of the kinds of meta-narratives and teleologies that the likes of Steven Pinker and Jared Diamond and Harari and others have sort of like imposed this, so we can ask different, what they would see as more interesting questions. So that could be one way. This sort of opening up new kinds of ways of thinking about how we do history or archaeology, or new kinds of questions we might raise. And also, to Leslie's point, other things that you find particularly problematic about or resentful, I think was the term that Leslie used, about the book, or things that you would say that's actually useful to me in terms of how I think about my work, or how I teach this. Go on, Sahil. Yes, you're going to add something into the mix as well.
I just wanted to kind of also, I just felt that I can build on this line of questioning that's happening, and just wanted to say that I also feel that this kind of almost an anti-colonial, but also an anarchist approach, which is questioning the modern formation of the nation state, it at the same time plays out as a critique of Western colonization, the history that's associated with it, how capitalism emerges with that. But at the same time, it also kind of, while building that critique, it also builds in a possibility to kind of erase some of that history that's so important to understanding how the modern nation state is homonormative, is racist, is at the same time neoliberal, and so it's so many other things. And so my worry with this book, apart from all the other critique that's already been said, is that while shaking the tree, it also sometimes shakes what we already know, is that we have to find a way around the state, or maybe staying with the trouble of the state and still figuring out a way to make that state work for us, maybe sometimes in non-state and anarchist modes. And so I think that, I feel, is also slightly being watered down, if others felt that or not. That's my concern with the book, not just the fact that it isn't rigorous, or it just doesn't go deep into those individual analyses that it's building into a collective critique, but it's also at the same time not holding that project together in a way that we can not forget what's happening to us today. Yeah.
Okay, Naam, go right ahead.
Thank you. Wonderful observations and comments. There was one thing that I guess Leslie's question about what I was resentful about, or what I might appreciate. I think I opened with something that I was resentful about, is the questioning of the fool's errand of trying to discuss the origins of some of these institutions. But in terms of something that I did appreciate, in addition to the notion of tinkering and social experimentation, one thing that came through as well was, I think they were talking about Minoan Crete, and how there seems to be some researchers who are very reluctant to see the possibilities of women in positions of political power and roles that are traditionally in Western history assigned to the domain of men. I think that's absolutely right to raise. And the more we look at the historical and archaeological record, the more we can see a huge range of variability when it comes to gender, ideas about gender, and roles within politics, within the military, within religion, etc. I can think of several examples just off the top of my head. One thing that anecdotally might be of interest, some of you may know this, the very famous burial of the Burka warrior. This is from about, I think it's the 10th or 11th century in Scandinavia. I think it was in Sweden, at a site where about 100 years ago, they excavated what was apparently the quintessential Viking leader burial. And they uncovered it with remains of horses that might have been sacrificed, other kinds of artifacts and burial items that represent leadership and military prowess, weapons, etc. And it was for the longest time assumed to be a male, until they analyzed the DNA very recently. And the findings were published, and lo and behold, this was a female. And I was struck by the sort of scholarly reaction to that article, where researchers actually asked the question, did you do your research properly? Is there a possibility that the DNA was contaminated in some way? And so actually this was really a male and there were mistakes made. And to me, the interesting part of all this is the scientific backlash, the process that sort of reflects the biases that we have, that many of us hold in our society. So I think that was one aspect of some of the research that they presented that I think I would take with me in my own ongoing work as well.
Yeah, I thought this was a great set of questions. Okay, so I think who put the question into the chat, Dan. I think you're right, Dan, in that the value of a book like this one consists in, if it can get people to start thinking differently about the possibilities of what form society can take. And as Nam was just indicating with the answer that he just gave to us, human beings are not infinitely plastic, but are very flexible about the kinds of social arrangements under which we can live. And so I think that having that kind of awareness that things don't have to be the way that they are today, and have not always been that way that they are today, is one of the great benefits of studying human variability, and that can come through anthropology or archaeology or history, and just having a more flexible and open mind towards what sort of the ways that we can live together. And so I do really appreciate the author's efforts to get us to do that. If there's something that I resent about books like this, it's when they lose my trust. I don't know how seriously to take any of the claims, because I can't run down all the footnotes. I don't have the time or the capability or the capacity or the knowledge. If I feel like I'm being misled, or that the authors are not being careful enough, then I don't know why I'm reading. And my friend and colleague Daniel Immerwahr wrote a review of this book for The Nation, which I looked up when I was I remembered reading the view and reading the review, and then went and reread it as I was preparing to read this book. And he points out that in the area that he knows the best, they have a reference, I don't think it was in the section that we read for today, but in a previous section, about kidnapping narratives in colonial America. And they make the claim that essentially all of the English settlers who were kidnapped stayed with the Native American communities to which they had been taken. And he said, I know the dissertation that Dan Immerwahr, the reviewer, said, like, I know the footnote, and the source that they're drawing from does not make the claim that they are saying that it makes. In fact, what that source says is that there were lots of kidnappings in both European settler communities, and Native Americans would kidnap people for various purposes from the other group, and that the people who were kidnapped as children tended to stay with the group that had kidnapped them, and people who were kidnapped as adults tended to would return at the earliest possible time to the community in which that they had come from. And that's just, that is not the claim that the authors make. And once I've lost trust in the author, and I have hundreds of pages ahead of me, I say, what am I, how do I know what I'm reading? How do I know that I can trust the authors to take me in a fair way through a reading of the evidence? That's where, if I'm not sure resentful is the word that I would use, because it's always fun to talk about books, even ones that make you frustrated. So I knew that there would be something to look forward to at the end, but that's where I get frustrated. you know, two brief comments. One that sort of brings us back to an earlier part of the conversation, and that I want to about their ideas of freedom and their definitions of freedom, and why I think that parts of their pessimism may be a little bit misplaced, if that's how we want to describe it. And that is that small communities, even egalitarian communities, and I am politically, I'm an egalitarian. I wish for the world to be more equal than it is, and try to work for those things through my politics. But small communities and egalitarian communities can be extremely coercive. So there are all kinds of social pressures that can be put onto people in small communities. So I'm not sure that the idea of small egalitarian communities and human freedom are, equated. I don't think that those two things are the same. There are all kinds of ways in which there are freedoms that we enjoy. The ability to leave communities provides us with a certain kind of freedom. And I think that there are all kinds of things that we might describe as freedoms that we enjoy today, that they because of their political perspective, or their particular interpretation of their political perspective, don't necessarily recognize. Another anarchist, another academic anarchist, James Scott, who's written these theories of the state and the ways that states. Scott's very prominent, written many important and influential books. But he wrote a little popular book some years ago, maybe, gosh, I don't know, maybe more than a decade now, probably, called 2 Cheers for Anarchism. And of course, the joke is that if you really believe in something, then it's 3 cheers for the thing. And he just thought that there were some things of value, some that the ways that states conduct themselves and conduct business tend to have flattening, can have certain deleterious effects. And I think that's the right way to go about dealing with big political ideologies. I can't think of any one of them that I would give more than 2 cheers for. And I think that, it just makes me think that there's not one right way, but that there are situations that are well described by different sets of ideas, and that there are moments and kinds of interactions that those things can capture, all of which can potentially contribute to improving human welfare and global justice, however it is that we're going to argue about and define those concepts. So, yeah, I can't get more than 2 cheers out for anarchism as a concept, and maybe only 1 for the book, but it does drop some important and interesting provocations, but without paying it off, at least for me as a reader.
Patrick, Nam, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for the questions. If I may take the last couple of minutes before we close up here, just a couple of quick thoughts of my own. I've had so many over the last 4 weeks. One of which is just to say, when it comes to a fool's errand, I think trying to write a book like this against what is, as much as there are booksellers who want to sell this within academia, it is not the kind of thing that, no one people in geography would go, Gerard Diamond's book's terrible. No one would go, is there a better version of that we could, no one doing that. The fact that they did it without applying for a grant, over the course of 10 years at night, I find an inspiring idea. And I do think that their point where they start out, which is that our stories of human history are outdated, are unnecessarily dull, which I thought was a really nice point. There's more interesting than you might think. As a non-archaeologist, I had no idea how interesting it was. Nam, you would know this, but presumably where you got into the field, but also that they are politically disabling in terms of what it tells us about the past and our present moment. I think that they accomplished that. I thought the move from equality to freedom is an interesting one, because I see them as writing out of a context where equality has tended to dominate the debates more recently politically. And I do think that they're right to say that a lot of this is coming out of the work of Piketty and his collaborators, and it is about sort of raise the tax code a little bit, distribute resources a little bit more fairly. And I think that what they're trying to say is there's an idea of freedom here. There's freedom to move, freedom to disobey, freedom to remake social relations that is a little bit more, I think, interesting and expansive to think with. At the same time, I do think that there's a certain way in which their vision of freedom, I think, sort of connects in an uneasy way with what I could imagine being a sort of Silicon Valley sort of tech elite vision in terms of their freedom to disobey and freedom to move, away from authority, in a slightly sort of libertarian angle to that. But I think it's interesting to think with. And, I think that maybe coming out of this, having put this to many different academics and having asked for archaeologists about the evidence in the book, I certainly agree with you, Patrick, that there are moments where, and other archaeologists also say, well, I disagree with, they get that wrong. In other cases, though, there's a sort of, well, I think I'd interpret that differently, or I think they're a little premature, or they're making a stronger claim that they could. But I kind of came out of these 4 sessions thinking, I'm more surprised by how much they got right, or how credible that interpretation was, than the amount that they got wrong, given the sort of just scope and ambition of the project. But I guess the main thing that I want to say is that I am so grateful when you're reading a book like this. You can't just read it at face value, as you're saying, Patrick. You find it, you don't have a guide here. No one to sort of help you know what you should take seriously and what is controversial. All of you have been wonderful guides for us, and everybody who's participated, to help us work through a text like this. I'm also grateful to the IRIS NRC staff, Chenard, Claire and Essie, who's not here right now, who've sort of made this happen and got the events promoted and the registration, and got free books out to people as well. And I'll close by just saying that, I picked up the book because I like reading books by David Graeber. One of the key reasons is, beyond the fact that I learn a lot, is that David Graeber made being an academic look like fun. He really did seem like he was kind of enjoying himself. And that, to me, was also one of the things that I found inspiring, is that you could sort of have ideas and throw things out there and start debates and have conversations. And in that spirit, I feel like, having read the book on my own, but now having read it with all of you on the screen, has been as well as enlightening, has been a really just fun endeavor for me, and I hope it's been the same for you as well. So thank you to Patrick and Nom for facilitating today, and to everybody who's been attending.
Very well said. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. It's been fun.